So I want to take the time to introduce you to a type of writing that is a little different from the type of writing that we've been talking about throughout this course. And what we'll be focusing on is exegetical writing, which is something that is done in New Testament and Old Testament studies. So the purpose of this lecture is a basic introduction on exegetical writing, what it is, and what to look out for. So what is exegesis? Now, before we delve into what exegesis is, I want to differentiate a little bit between an exegetical paper and an exegetical working paper. So the former, an exegetical paper is a structured essay organized around a central thesis. So in many ways, it's similar to a research paper. But whereas a research paper or a theological research paper is focused on a theological idea, an exegetical paper would be centered and organized around an interpretation of a biblical text. Whereas an exegetical working paper is a close reading of a specific text. And perhaps we can think of it as a more advanced version of devotionals you might do at home. And so when you do a devotional, you have a specific biblical text in mind, and through prayer, you try to, and through repeated reading of that text, you try to figure out what it means. Well, an exegetical paper in many ways might be organizing all the many exegetical working papers you have done and organizing it around a central structured paper. So many of your OT 500 and your NT 500 courses, which are Introduction to Old Testament and Introduction to New Testament, will require several exegetical working papers. Then the final paper will require the working papers to be organized into one main exegetical paper. What's exegesis then? And I want to focus on the prefix ex there, exegesis, which is an explanation of critical interpretation of a text. Whereas the prefix there, eisegesis, is the interpretation of a text by reading into it one's own ideas. So the former, ex, means out, whereas eis means in. So you really want your biblical interpretation to be based on the text. You want to try to figure out what the text says instead of injecting your own preconceived views onto it. And hermeneutics is the study of the methodological principles of interpretation. So an exegesis is an explanation or critical interpretation of a text. Eisegesis is the interpretation of a text by reading into it one's own ideas. And oftentimes, when we're interpreting the Bible, we get those two confused. Oftentimes, we read into the text our own ideas, thinking it's what the text actually has to say. So, for example, in Ephesians 5:18, we read the text, "Do not get drunk on wine, which leads to debauchery. Instead, be filled with the Spirit." So perhaps an example of eisegesis would be using this text as a way to justify banning the drinking of wine altogether for Christians, which isn't what the text is actually saying. And ideally, what we want to do is we want to focus on what the Bible actually says, exegesis, and then try to apply it to our own context application. So that's where the kind of change comes, where in the act of exegesis, we try to figure out what it means, the principle, and then apply that principle to different circumstances, and particularly our own context. You may have heard of this thing called proof texting, where you can use the scripture to pretty much justify anything by selectively using Bible passages. And so we want to avoid proof texting. So then how do we avoid this? Context matters. History, when was it written? Literary, what genre is it in? Canonical, how does it compare with the rest of the canon, the Bible? Because we believe that the Bible does not contradict itself. Reason is also important. Does it make sense? What does the original language say? Something may be lost in translation when we're going from Hebrew to English. Right? That is why theological studies and MDiv really highly emphasizes the original languages. So these are some of the tools that will be helpful as you try to figure out and do the act of exegesis and help you interpret a particular biblical text, which will be helpful in turn as you write your exegetical papers.